Hello, everybody, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 4 of A Conversation with Cometan. Today, I'm going to be speaking to a new guest, James Patton, who I have spoken to before regarding my PhD, but I haven't actually had him yet as a guest on A Conversation with Cometan. So really excited to explore with James his spiritual evolution and how his spiritual beliefs, his faith, has been sort of developed through the work that he does in peace building and peacemaking all around the world. So I'm really excited for you guys to see this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, let me know. Give this video a like. And without further ado, enjoy the conversation, guys. Well, thanks, James, for coming to speak to me again. It's nice to see you again. We met early in the year for my PhD research, and you were a great help with that. And I wanted to sort of have another conversation, one that's a little less formal, one that's sort of maybe more about your beliefs, my beliefs, and also maybe a bit about some of the work that you've been doing since we spoke. Just for people who aren't aware of who you are, just let them know sort of what you do and who you are, really, and also maybe what you believe, and so we can get into that a little bit.
I'm happy that I stole his resting spot in my work chair. Yeah, sure. So just for clarity's sake, the video will be put up on your website. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, it's great to see you again. Thanks for reaching out. Thanks for your interest in what we do and how we do what we do.
Yes.
As you know, and as I'm sure you will mention on the site, I am the president and CEO of an organization called the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. So we're a conflict resolution organization.
Yes.
Truly believes that the best of our faith traditions should actually help us solve collective problems rather than drive us towards deeper crises. So that's kind of where we do our thing. We look at areas where conflict and religious identity overlap and try to see how we can engage faith to help mitigate violence.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose one of the first questions I had actually was, I presume you are a person of faith. I just to presume that, just because you're in this sort of field, maybe you're not, but just are you a person of faith at all, or is it?
Yeah, well, faith is an interesting term, right? So this could be our whole interview. Yeah. So, I mean, a little bit of backstory, I guess. I grew up as a Roman Catholic.
Yes.
And then probably in my late teens, I left that for what I guess I called for a while my agnosto-atheist Taoist Buddhist phase, which is also another term for undergraduate, right? And and I think Hobbes has given up on me here. All right, but, and I think it was my time when I was in South America the first time with the Peace Corps. I was in Paraguay, and I was living in a rural community there that professed largely to be Catholic, but really was kind of a syncretic expression of faith between the Catholic traditions and the pre-Columbian traditions, and that's not unusual in Latin America.
Yes.
But what I really learned in that community was this idea of community, this idea that people could be driven to care for one another regardless of their expression of religious faith. So I took that, and then I came with that back to the States after having traveled and witnessed some of the difficult social justice questions of Latin America coming out of the 80s into the 90s. Particularly Central American wars and the way that the Jesuit theologians had been connected to that, and some questions about liberation theology. And so I had a lot of things that I was curious about, some of which were grounded in the language of my past, a Catholic framework, the Catholic social justice teachings, but much of which was really kind of I would say beyond that, if I can use that term. I was not yet exposed to the concept of mysticism and some of these more practices, but I knew that there was something there that I wanted to explore. And honestly, I came back with this thought about how does a similar faith doctrine and practice inspire one person to think that the divine calls them to care for and protect all people, regardless of how they look or worship or think. And the person sitting right next to him in the same house of worship hears the opposite message, which is, if you're not within the quote unquote right practice, then you are out of divine favor, and therefore you are not only worthy of punishment by God, or however you frame your concept of the divine, but you're perhaps the divine is asking that person to help them punish you, so they're going to go out and be the hands of justice, so to speak, and little j justice, of course. But so I was just very curious, how do humans find in their spiritual practice, particularly within the same frameworks, such different conclusions, where you have people doing things that are grotesque and awful to one another, and you've got other people who are transcending some of the more difficult spiritual challenges of reconciliation or restorative justice, things like that. And then I guess I sort of fell in with the wrong crowd. I started working with a bunch of Quaker peace builders, and still hanging out with Jesuit liberation theologians. And next thing you know, I was in the divinity school studying social justice theology. And I started working very closely with the Quakers and did that on and off for some time. So I did that when I was in Cambridge in Massachusetts, and then I worked in Cambodia through the Quaker office. Then I worked again for the Quakers later years in Colombia for a number of years in the Andean region. So, but by then I had sort of recognized that for me, the Quaker practice was something that I found very attractive. And it was mostly attractive because it focuses quite a bit of energy on the questions of there's my son. You're gonna have to be patient with me. Hang on one second. The days of Zoom, right?
Yes.
But the Quaker tradition, that for me, it's much more focused on how you walk through the world, what your sense of relationship with self, other, and the world itself is, in terms of spirit and spirituality and divinity. I mean, there's a rich theology here. It's not a new agey, and I don't use new age disparagingly, but I reference the fact that many people do use that disparagingly.
Yes.
But I don't mean it to be this kind of intangible sense of spirit that doesn't have any kind of articulation of what that means. I actually have quite a strong articulation of what I mean by that. But basically the idea that as you move through the world, you affect things, and those are the things that you can control. Those are the things that, as the Jesuits would say, you can discern about. And get a sense of, through your discernment, whether or not this is aligned with something that is more elevated or less elevated, more divine, less divine. The Jesuits would use kingdom language, the liberationists, whether the kingdom is being brought into the world or not. And again, I still find myself referencing a lot of sort of Catholic language because you get steeped in that for the first 18 years of life, and it's a strong framework, although I have very, very deep differences with Christian theology as it's practiced in most spaces right now. But again, that's, it's nuance. I think that for me, the kind of rules and doctrines are a really great place to find as a foundation for behavior and care for self and others. But you have to go past that. It's sort of like great art is not just made because you understand color theory, right? Great art is made because you go past the color theory into a space that is harder to articulate, define, and put into a book, you know? And I think that's true of faith practice as well. And the other thing I really appreciated about the Quaker tradition, the non-structured Quaker tradition, because there's nuance there, is, first of all, there is not any encouragement. In fact, there's some discouragement from trying to convince others that they should join your faith.
Right.
I think that that's one of the great mistakes we make in religious practice, is thinking that our task is to tell others what to do.
Yes.
I think most of us should be working on what we do and just kind of stay there. If we all did that, we'd probably be in a lot better place.
Yeah.
But then the other thing about the Quaker tradition is this idea that, you know, the truth doesn't necessarily adhere to a single book or a single text or a single way of understanding things, that frankly, the divine is bigger than that. You know, and I've worked in Latin America a lot. I remember working with pastors down there, and they would sing these songs at the beginning of our work together. There was one in particular called Cuán Grande Es, How Great You Are.
Right.
And then immediately turn around and start talking about how only they held the truth. And I would have these reflections with them about, well, I understand that for you, getting to God through Jesus is the right path. Okay, that's fine. I'm not in any way questioning that. But then you turn around and say, but God can only get back to humans through Jesus as well. So, you know, the idea that if you're not a believer, there's no divine action in your world, or you don't have access to that. And I would ask them, I say, well, you know, who are we to put that kind of a restriction on the divine? Isn't that a bit arrogant, you know, to say, well, this is who you can and can't be? Oh, great divine, you know. So how do we know that God in their concept is not functioning in the shaman who is trying to build peace, just like the person in their tradition who's trying to build peace? And I would ask them, I say, so everybody in your tradition is a great person, right? And they're like, no, you know, there's Juan Pablo down on the corner. And everybody in a different tradition, they're awful, evil people. No, they do nice things. And I said, well, can't you see then the possibility, at least, that our concept of the divine might be limited, and that when we start to impose those frameworks, we're really starting to try to make God in our own image. You know, there's an old Catholic nun, and whose name escapes me now, who was famous for saying, you know that you made God in your own image when God hates all the same people you do.
Yes.
And so honestly, I kind of house myself with the non-structured Quaker tradition. But I would say quintessentially someone who is listening.
Yes.
And who is testing, and who is failing, and who is aspiring, and who is constantly reminding myself that I don't know. And I think in the not knowing, we might have a chance to actually gain access to some revelation, let's call it. And I don't mean that in a Christian sense necessarily, but you know what I mean? Like the idea that we can touch something that does resonate. I mean, humility, I think, is one of the most important virtues in spiritual practice.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting.
I know that's not a satisfying answer, probably.
No, there's so many different things there. I think, firstly, to say, I feel connected to Quakerism as well, primarily because it was actually founded in the county in which I live, which is Lancashire. So you know, I can go to the hill where George Fox first. It's not that far away, you know, where he sort of had this realization. So it's got a very long history for me, and the place where I come from. But also, it's interesting from your work then, and sort of, you mentioned earlier that, you know, you've just got back from Africa, so you're interacting with lots of different people, probably more diverse amounts of people than the average person, maybe. Does that in a way allow you to see that really we're all kind of striving for the same goals in a way? Do you kind of ascribe to the idea of perennialism? So this idea of that fundamentally all religions have similar goals, similar principles at the very foundations of them. Has that been sort of undermined, or has that been sort of, you know, in speaking to lots of different types of people with different types of beliefs, are they all kind of saying the same thing, or are they actually saying different things, basically?
I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say all religions are saying the same thing. I mean, many of them are saying dramatically different things. It depends on how and where and what you read in them, you know. I mean, I don't think it's really, again, what is the religion saying is a very different question than what is possible for people and relationships in this world as we move through this life, right? Those are very, very different ways of posing the question. And I don't think that I don't think that the question about doctrine and can doctrine be aligned and unified, I don't think that, for me anyway, that's a useful question. You know, one of the things about faith that I think is really important in my mind is that faith is in itself a paradoxical term. You know, the word faith means to believe in something, right?
Yeah.
It also means not to know.
Yeah.
Right? When you have faith in something, or you put your faith in something, it means you're giving up control over it, and you're stepping back and allowing something or someone else to take the lead, and you're just accepting, right? And so, but you do that in a space of simultaneously not knowing but also believing. And so in and of itself, this idea is one of paradox. And I think if we can live within that paradox, particularly in a questioning way, where you have a grounding, you have things that you think are true, but at the same time, you're walking through the world knowing that there are things you need to be open to knowing, right? And so, yeah, I mean, my bookshelf's full of sacred texts, but you know, many of them say different things. Some of them within the same text are contradictory, and I think the struggle to either remove contradiction from a single faith or across faiths is an effort that, you know, for me personally is not a useful expense of my time, because I don't know what that would accomplish. I think more importantly is saying, are there things that we as human beings across all of our great differences can find that will help us help each other, rather than frame things in terms of opposition where we have to harm one another? For me, it really comes down to kind of the binary of healing versus harm.
Yes.
And where does the divine sit in that? And there are plenty of faith traditions, and there are plenty of parts of faith traditions that people can point to and say, look, there is the divine harming people, punishing people. And then there are other parts of the same tradition that say, oh, it's, you know, it's a religion of love, you know. So if we get caught up in that stuff, then, you know, it's sort of like statistics. You can find things to prove whatever you want to prove. You know, you can find things to support whatever you want to support in the texts. And if you get stuck there, then there's no real room for the divine, whatever you want to describe that as. I mean, I think if we just start from this sense, this is one of the things I do owe my Catholic upbringing, this idea that we do not have God mind, right? We do not have the divine mind. We are imperfect. Now, of course, as a Catholic, that's you're reminded of that consistently, at least in my Catholic upbringing. That we are all sinners and have to go confess, and not necessarily untrue, but I think the point that I take from it is, well, that means that there's always more growth. There's always more potential for growth, and if that growth is tagged with a term akin to God or Allah or the divine or whatever you want, and there's a certain purity associated with it, okay, great. Well, but what does that look like, and how does it inform me? I had this conversation with a scholar not too long ago about it was a Christian scholar, and we were talking about sin and things like that, and I said, well, within the Christian framework, you've got Lucifer, and Lucifer was the angel of light. What was Lucifer's big sin? Because I know there are strains within Christianity that say Lucifer is actually waging war against God, is literally on the planet trying to overthrow the kingdom. But I step back and I think of it in terms of this aspirational divinity, which is, can we be more healed? Isn't that the divine intention? Well, what was Lucifer's big problem is he got too close to the truth. He was the right hand, the angel of light, and thought, I don't need the old man anymore, right? I got it all figured out. And in that moment decided to live in a godless space, right? A space where there was no room for the divine, whether it be inspiration or growth or other things, because you're standing on the capital T truth. There's nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't point this criticism at anyone in particular, but I know a lot of faith leaders who feel that they're standing on the capital T truth, and you look around, you think, well, where's room for the divine then in your process?
And humility as well, isn't it? Like you mentioned.
Well, and that's the essential part of it, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, actually, and maybe a lot of lessons for people in that just that idea. I think maybe just to go back to what you mentioned earlier about sort of doctrine, and obviously people gravitate towards something like the Catholic Church because it does present that it has the answers. I think if it said, well, maybe it might not be the answer, or maybe this is true, maybe it's not, it wouldn't work, So I think that's interesting as well, to look at how really it's essential to the survival of not just the Catholic Church, any religion, that it is kind of definite. But then you've got things like the Quaker faith, but also other religions as well that maybe don't make as many definitive statements on God or the nature of God, but something like the Catholic Church maybe feels like
I'm not sure I agree.
It has to maintain that sort of definitiveness, and
I don't know though. I don't know if I agree.
Maybe it's maybe
there are great mystical traditions and contemplative traditions within the Catholic practice, right?
Yeah, of course.
And there have been plenty of fights fought even within the church over who's right about this, who's right about that. So I don't know that there is a definitiveness. If there were, you wouldn't need a faith leader. It'd be right there in front of you. You wouldn't need an interpreter or a guide.
I think maybe I mean in sort of some of those really fundamental things like the existence of God itself, or Jesus as God, or the Son of God, or the crucifixion, some of these things that are really, really fundamental that have to be.
If you look at the histories, they weren't. There were great fights. About who
the nature of
what was the nature of Jesus, what was the nature of the Trinity, and there still are debates about these things, and then churches split, and continuing revelation is another great example. Can things change? Can God reveal more things? Are we able to have more insight as a people through the divine? And
yes,
but I think what you're driving at, and I would agree with definitely, is this idea that the structures, the institutions require a certain kind of, and I'm going to sound like I'm tearing down all religious institution, and I'm actually not. I think religious institution can be quite powerful in many, many ways. And in fact, we work very closely with religious institution. But undeniably, when you build an institution that is a hierarchy, there are powers within those hierarchies. And power can manifest in two ways. It can be power over or power with, right? So you can empower another, or you can lord over and have power and control over another. And sadly, human institutions are very easily given to the trap of getting to hoard power over those who are within the institution. So, churches are not immune to this. It's honestly, in the spiritual practice, I think it's quite a dangerous thing in some ways, because there's a certain rigidity to an institution that allows them for powerful individuals to control those underneath them. And one of the great ways to do that is to use narratives of truth, right? I mean, that's without a doubt. I agree with that part, but simultaneously, you have individuals who will ascend in those structures who can do really, really amazing things because they try to empower others, but it does, an institution is on a less stable grounding if it says this all might not be true, but it's also inspiring. I remember when the Dalai Lama said that at one point. They were asking him, somebody asked him a question about, if it were proven that the Christian God exists or something scientifically. I'm mangling the history of this thing, but at some point they put to him basically an existential argument about his faith not being true, about Buddhism not being true. And he said, well, then I'd have to stop being a Buddhist, because he was saying, if I can see the evidence of that, then I'm wrong. And this is the pinnacle of the Tibetan Buddhist faith, and 14th reincarnation of a faith leader who is willing to admit the whole thing might be a mistake. That takes a lot of interior strength, and I'm not sure that most of us have that. We get very hung up on our truths.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, just to give a bit of background about myself, because we come from maybe pretty similar backgrounds, but I mean, I was brought up a Catholic, but I was brought up a traditionalist Catholic. So I went to sort of the Latin Mass, and actually my grandparents were in England, some of the leaders of the Latin Mass being preserved, basically, and they used to get told off by the bishop and even the Pope at some point as well for continuing the Latin Mass. They went on this sort of crusade in like the 1970s to keep it going. So that's sort of my background. So I come from this sort of background of everything that's in the catechism is absolute. Do you know what I mean? So that took me a long time to to get out of that way of thinking, but it's still there. It's still very ingrained still. And I don't blame that. A lot of other people in my family do sort of have a lot of bitterness there towards that. I don't, because I can look at it from a broader perspective. But I don't know, just coming from that kind of background, it actually made me love religion even more, because I found out when I went to university that there were so many other religions to learn about, because we weren't allowed to ask questions. That was the kind of upbringing that I had. We weren't allowed to talk about Islam or Buddhism or anything else, so for me, someone who's been brought up in that way, it was fantastic to be able to look at all these different religions and be opened up to them, Did you feel similar maybe when sort of you were younger, when you could begin to explore these things for yourself, maybe these different
and I don't think, I actually believe that religious literacy, knowing about other faith traditions, is a great way to hone your own convictions. That I think a lot of people are afraid, if I learn about this, then it's going to pull me or my kids away from their belief structures. Well, if the belief structures are thoughtful, and if they have a spiritual grounding, and if they're contemplative, then they should be explored and not compared, but exposed to other frames of thinking. I don't think that will weaken them. I think that'll strengthen them in many cases. I think the problem is when we have this rigid, rules-based concept where there isn't really any reflection, thought, or even spiritual development in that structure, then that structure is very fragile. It can easily shatter. And I think that people then try to protect themselves and others by not exposing them to other things. But if you're looking for, if you're looking for evidence, for example, of a loving God in a Christian framework, and you go into another religious framework where people care for one another, well, there's more evidence, right? And so doesn't that just kind of reinforce your sense of, again, it really comes down to, for me, it's sort of like, all right, if there is this is how I kind of evolved out of the Christian framework. When I was a kid, I was thinking, well, if there's this loving God who created everything, and then why is my intellect a trick?
Yeah.
Why are these things that I'm being told by my faith leaders that I shouldn't question, that I should just believe? Because another part of me is inquiring, is curious. How is that? What kind of a divinity is trying to put these sort of landmines in front of me that I might not know how to navigate, just to trick me? It doesn't seem right? It doesn't seem like the divinity that meshes with one that wants to care for and cultivate and heal over harm and punish. And so I couldn't get over that, and I kept reflecting on it, thinking, well, if my intellect's a trick, if I'm supposed to just figure out, I'm supposed to ignore it, if I see all these books, what if I grew up in a different faith tradition and I see this other book and I'm supposed to just randomly choose the right one because I'm told by some other human being I should?
Yeah.
And this is awfully tricky, and I know that there's a lot, you have to prove yourself and free will, but shouldn't you be proving yourself and express free will through the values and virtues rather than just kind of randomly choosing or not choosing the right thing, like with no, I don't know. I just don't get that argument. It doesn't make sense to me. It seems, honestly, that's a divinity I probably wouldn't want to hang out with for the rest of eternity, because they don't seem like a personality that I wouldn't be able to trust so much all the time, and I'm being tongue in cheek, and I'm not trying to disparage anyone's convictions. It's just, for me personally, it seems to make much more sense that if there is a divine entity or even idea in what is life, which is an undeniable miracle and transcendent and somewhat inconceivable experience, then wouldn't that be all of the best of what's possible? Yes. Is manifest through that divinity, and all of the worst, all of the pain and all of the suffering and all of the hatred and harm, wouldn't that be contrary to a life-giving source? So honestly, I know it sounds kind of simple maybe and somewhat I don't know, maybe it sounds a little emotionally driven, but it seems right? Yeah. And so that's the discernment thing. I say, okay, well, if I can find in goodness the evidence of divinity, then why am I prohibited from finding that in someone who's being a really good person, even if their faith doctrine is not one that I agree with,
Yeah, and obviously, you apply that in the work that you do, and that allows you and other people who apply that same principle to work with different individuals, no matter what sort of faith background they're from, and be able to connect to them, not just to talk to them, but actually to connect with them and engage with them. Yeah, and I think also maybe divinity is simple. Maybe it's we humans who actually complicate it too much, and maybe it is just that simple. And I don't know. Maybe we're wrong, but the simple.
Well, honestly, I mean, for me, it's like deciding that someone, because they say a certain thing or wear a certain thing or carry a certain book or speak a certain language or have a certain, skin color, deciding that they're in the group and need to be protected versus out of the group and need to be persecuted. That I've seen that replicate itself throughout human history all over the place.
Yeah.
Gangs, wars, militaries, nation states. That doesn't seem very divine to me. It seems very, very human. So if we're basing our religions on that same principle, it's a little harder for me to be convinced,
Yes. Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. And I'm just, there's not got much time left, but I would just say one other thing as well. So, clearly the work you've done has affected your faith, and would you say vice versa? Sort of, the more you're able to travel and meet different people, do you think your faith's going to develop even further? You're saying that you've gone from being a Catholic and then you're sort of expanding on different religions. You think, I don't know, maybe in another 20 years there might be another faith?
I sure hope so.
Are you sort
I sure hope so. I don't want to get stuck anywhere.
Yeah,
I mean, the spiritual evolution is the whole point.
Yeah. Definitely.
It's if I get stuck, then I'm there again. There's no room. There's no more room for what is beyond me.
Yes.
And I'm not. I don't believe that that's, at least spiritually, is healthy for me. So I hope so.
Yeah. And I think that's a good sort of principle to end it on, actually, because I think maybe people can feel that sort of stagnation in their spiritual evolution. So if we kind of keep open-minded and think, well, maybe there is another faith out there for me, or maybe I can grow in this way, then that's maybe a good principle to to take forward. Thanks for the little conversation. I don't want to take too much more time up for you, but hopefully we can meet again and have another another conversation like this. But
without a doubt. I mean, I appreciate the opportunity to think through these things, and it's something, unfortunately, in our work, even though we don't spend as much time talking about this stuff because we're busy trying to get people to stop killing each other. But I think what you're going through, from what little I've seen of it and what you've shared, is very interesting and fascinating. And I think I'd love to hear about your evolution as well, because I'm sure it's as it continues.
We've got. We can do another little conversation, I'm sure, and we can arrange that and maybe tell you a little bit about that. But it's been really good to speak to you again, James, and I hope we can have another conversation similar.
Yeah, likewise.
Thanks very much. Okay,
I appreciate it, and best of luck with everything.
Best of luck for your work as well. Yeah,
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Where are you traveling next, by the way? Do you know?
I go to Morocco in a couple of weeks.
There you go. Brilliant. Yeah. That's it. Okay, thanks very much, James. See you later.
All right, thank you.
Keep in touch.
All right, take care.